Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of The Defense of the Faith by Cornelius Van Til from my atheist perspective. In this video, I will be covering chapter 10 of the book, which is titled Christian Metaphysics. So let's get started, shall we? Van Til opens the chapter by quoting Van Halsema, a fellow theologian of his, another one of the critics to whom he is responding in this second half of the book. And Van Halsema says that Van Til regards metaphysics as being of secondary concern. Van Til responds by saying that he is interested in metaphysics and in defending metaphysics, but only the metaphysics of the Bible, which include the self-contained triune God, the plan for God for his creation, the fact that God did create the universe, and that one fact is the basis for all other facts about the universe, God's control over everything he created, and the redemptive work of Christ. Those are the aspects of the metaphysics that Van Til is interested in and that he means to promote and defend through his work. And there's a slight problem with the metaphysics Van Til says he's interested in defending. And actually, he describes this problem pretty well himself when he says, quote, "This metaphysic is so simple and so simply biblical that Christian philosophers would say that it is nothing but theology. Most non-Christian philosophers would say that too, I imagine. Metaphysics is the name we give to the field of philosophy devoted to thinking about existence at the most fundamental level. Metaphysical principles are derived from our contemplations of our experiences, from thinking about how we know what we know and what there is to know and what the nature of the things we know is. Deep questions that probe the very state of being at the most basic level we can even attempt to comprehend. In other words, metaphysics can't be simply biblical, because by definition, metaphysics pertains to stuff that is way more basic than anything you could only find out from reading a book. And Van Til says himself that the only source from which we humans could have ever derived the principle of the Trinity, for example, is the Bible, which means it's theology, as Van Til says, but not metaphysics, because metaphysics is the study of being, not the study of the Bible. So when Van Halsema says that Van Til doesn't care about metaphysics, he's right. And Van Til has just shown us that he's right, because what Van Til considers metaphysics is different from what pretty much anyone else means when they say that word. It's like if someone said to me, "Say, Steve, you're not a fan of high fantasy, are you?" And I came back with, "Well, sure I am. I love high fantasy. It's just that I'm only interested in stories that take place in the present day, in a realistic setting, not unlike our everyday world, and, no magic or mythical things or heroic quests or anything like that. I just like, gritty police procedurals. Things like that. That sort of high fantasy is what I enjoy." Van Til explains the concept of metaphysics held by non-Christian philosophers. He explains why it is what it is, why non-Christian philosophers have such a different view of metaphysics than Van Til has, by saying that they feel this way and they have this concept of metaphysics because they, as fallen descendants of Adam, refuse to acknowledge the distinction between themselves as creatures and God as their creator. They are the heirs of the intellectual tradition that stretches back to the ancient Greeks, who, like all unregenerated sinners, suppressed their innate sense of God and instead spoke of gods other than the true God that we find depicted in the Bible. That still doesn't make theology metaphysics, though, does it? Sorry, if God wanted you to be able to discuss his self-contained, self-defining, triune nature in the context of metaphysics, he should have revealed those traits somewhere other than in the text of the Bible so that everyone, regardless of their religious background, could have discovered and studied them. But he didn't do that, did he? No. So I guess you're stuck with theology then. Not corny. I apologize for my aggressive tone, my acerbic tone. He's wearing on me. He's starting to wear on me. More on the Greeks and why they got this metaphysics thing so wrong. Quote, "It is not merely that the Greeks had not yet heard of such a God. It is rather that in Adam they had heard this God speak to them, and in Adam they had virtually denied his existence. When Adam, for all men, refused to take God's prediction of punishment for disobedience seriously, he virtually said that the facts and laws of the universe are not under God's control, but operate by virtue of chance. This is ultimate and utter irrationalism." But according to Van Til, the fact that the Greeks had not yet heard of a God would be the main thing, right? The Greeks didn't know who this God was. I mean, it would almost have to be that way if you follow what Van Til has been saying so far. He said previously that despite that innate sense of deity that we all have, that the only way we could ever learn certain things about God, such as the Trinity, is by reading the Bible. So if the Bible didn't exist when the philosophers of ancient Greece were first arguing about metaphysics, and it didn't, there's no way they could have incorporated that concept of God into their metaphysics, even if they would have wanted to. Also, even if we grant for the sake of argument that Adam was a real person, which he wasn't, how does anything he did have anything to do with the Greeks? Van Til says that Adam was the representative of all men when he disobeyed God. But when did we vote on that? And by we, I mean all the people who have come along since Adam, who he was supposedly representing. We who had no knowledge and no ability to approve, disapprove, or consent or object to anything Adam did because we didn't fucking exist yet. When did we all get together and take a vote to retroactively elect Adam our representative and agree to be subject to the consequences of things he supposedly did thousands of years ago that really didn't have shit to do with any of us? I'm pretty sure that that never happened. I'm also pretty sure that the concept of holding a person legally responsible for something someone else did centuries before they were born, which is what original sin is all about, is considered unacceptable by any just system of law in the world. But that's neither here nor there. So the Greeks had not heard of the God of the Bible. They had not heard the God of the Bible speak to them through Adam because they didn't know who the fuck Adam was, and because they had never seen the Bible that supposedly contained the words which God spoke to Adam, or at least the important ones. Which means not only is Van Til basing his metaphysics in a particular religious text, which renders it not metaphysics, he's also using arguments to discredit the non-Christian philosophy of metaphysics that rely on things that never actually happened and wouldn't have made any sense even if they had. But it's those other people who are guilty of ultimate and utter irrationalism. Okay. Also, you may have noticed that Van Til again insists on a false dichotomy of either God plans and controls everything or chance. I just wanted to point that out in case you didn't catch it when I read the quote. Next, Van Til goes on arguing against non-Christian metaphysics. He writes that Catholic and non-Reformed Protestants have theologies that are contaminated by non-biblical elements taken from classical philosophy. He blames them for taking textbooks written by non-Christians at face value, which is just, oh, it's delicious, because everyone knows that you should take the Bible at face value, and that's it. Oh wait, you should take the Bible and this book at face value. Take both of these books, this and the Bible, at face value, but then that's it. Everything else cannot be taken at face value. No others. Anyway, long story short, people who disagree with Van Til have either not read the Bible or they're not reading it the right way, and they're wrong and they suck. That's basically the gist of it. From there, Van Til moves on to specific objections to his Christian metaphysics. First, those offered by J. Oliver Buswell Jr., who was the dean of Covenant Seminary. He was a major figure in the Presbyterian Church in the 20th century, and he's actually the one who's credited with coining the term presuppositionalism. Now, what could these fellows possibly have to fight about? Maybe a bunch of arcane religious bullshit that nobody who isn't a theologian with literally nothing else to do could possibly give fuck one about? Let's find out. Before Van Til gets too deep into responding to the objections of Buswell, he does his favorite thing ever, which is to restate his position. Quote, "My primary interest is now, as it always has been, to teach what the Bible contains as the infallible rule of faith and practice in the way of truths about God and his relation to man and the world. I believe in this infallible book, in the last analysis, because of the inward work of the Holy Spirit, bearing witness by and with the Word in my heart." And he's quoting from the Westminster Confession of Faith there at the end. So he believes what he believes because he just believes it, is all. And if you really want to know why he believes it, it's because the Holy Spirit makes him believe it. So there. Good night, folks. No, just kidding. Van Til emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between God as he is in himself and God as he relates to his creation. He says that he, Van Til, constantly stresses that God must be considered first as what he is in himself, prior to any consideration of how he relates to the universe he created. Because remember, Van Til insists that God and the universe are not co-relational. God is ultimate and subject only to himself, and he must be first considered in that way. He also says that no part of the Trinity must be considered subordinate to any other part of the Trinity, and for these reasons, Van Til rejects Buswell's charge that he is a Hegelian, that is, one who holds with the philosophy espoused by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or Hegel. Hegel. It's Hegel. I took German. Van Til next dismisses, I should say, Buswell's objection to his saying that God is the ultimate cause of whatsoever comes to pass, even sin. Buswell accused Van Til of saying that God is the author of sin, which doesn't really sit well with Buswell, which I guess wouldn't sit well with many Christians. Now, Van Til is addressing himself to Buswell in the section I'm about to quote, hence the use of second person. Quote, "Your readers must certainly have been amazed at hearing that I unequivocally teach that God is the author of sin. What did I actually say? If God is the ultimate cause back of whatsoever comes to pass, Pigius can, on his basis, rightly insist that God is the author of sin." Quoting from Common Grace, page 66. "First, you misquote me. You quote me as saying, 'on this basis,' while I say, 'on his basis.' Omitting that phrase makes me say the exact opposite of what I actually said. Pigius denies the validity of the distinction between remote and proximate causes. Accordingly, he holds that a proximate cause, in Calvin's sense of the term, is no real cause, and that the only real cause of sin, on Calvin's basis, must be God. Is he logically inconsistent with his own assumption when he reasoned thus? He is not." God, he's like one of those insufferably pedantic pseudo-intellectual dipshits who post comments as long as term papers beneath YouTube videos. You want to know why when people make response videos occasionally to my shit, I don't respond back in video form? It's because to anyone outside of the usually quite tiny sphere of interest for those responses, that exchange would sound exactly like that quote that I just read. Dull people quibbling over dull, pointless, petty horseshit that for whatever reason is really, really important to them. No thank you. Anyway, lest this turn into such a video, or worse yet, an empty meta-commentary on the textual equivalent of such a video, I'll move on. Van Til explains that he believes God created the universe because it pleased him to use it to manifest the glory of his eternal power, wisdom, and goodness. Seems legit. I mean, what's the use of being all-powerful, all-wise, and all-good if no one's around to be impressed by it but you? Van Til next explains his view on sin and its implications, saying that he believes that God dealt with every person who was ever to exist through Adam as their representative. This time Van Til explains why this supposedly makes sense, because even people who did not exist yet historically at the time of Adam had been thought of by God. And so he treated them through Adam. It was perfectly fair, because even though we weren't actually there at the time, God saw us coming. He knew as a part of his perfect plan that we were going to come along, and he also knew everything we were going to do. So he said, I'm just going to handle these people through Adam. And as we all know, if God can do something, it's okay for him to actually do it, because God defines what is good according to himself, which is totally fair. So, if you still think it's outrageously unfair to treat the first human ever as the representative of all humans who will ever live, and to punish all of those other people for mistakes that first person made, it's not unfair, because God says so, and he gets to decide what's fair, not you. So take a seat. Van Til defends his belief that Christ didn't die for everyone, but for the elect, a view which Buswell calls, quote, intolerable. It doesn't make sense, Van Til says, citing Charles Hodge, to believe that Jesus died for the sake of people God had already decided he wasn't going to save. Besides, Van Til says his position is no different than Calvin's, so why doesn't Buswell pick on Calvin too, huh? No commentary in the book on why God is the biggest asshole ever for creating people that he knew all along he was going to condemn to hell, and creating a mechanism of salvation that could very easily have applied to all people and saved everybody, and then, for whatever reason, choosing not to do it and only to apply it to a very small number of people. God is good because God says he's good, so there you go. Van Til ends his response to Buswell by defending at length his presuppositional method of apologetics. He says, in part, quote, to begin with, then, I take what the Bible says about God and his relation to the universe as unquestionably true on its own authority. The Bible requires men to believe that he exists apart from and above the world, and that he, by his plan, controls whatever takes place in the world. Everything in the created universe, therefore, displays the fact that it is controlled by God, that it is what it is by virtue of the place that it occupies in the plan of God. Men cannot get away from this evidence. They see it round about them. They see it within them. So the evidence for God is all around us and within us. But we only know that it is evidence for God because the Bible tells us so, and we are to accept the Bible unquestionably on its own authority, which means that Van Til's supposedly ubiquitous and undeniable evidence of God is nothing of the kind. If the examining of the evidence itself doesn't point you to God, then it's not evidence of God. That's how evidence works. It doesn't magically become evidence of God just because the Bible tells you that God made everything and controls everything. It's like if I came to your house and I said, hey, I built this house, you know. And you said, really? Well, that's interesting, because when I bought this house, the realtor told me that Acme Contractors built this house. What evidence do you have that you built this house? And I said, well, I built this house, so the evidence is the house and everything about it. I built it, so everything about the house is evidence that I built it. It's all, the evidence is all around you. It's surrounding you. I built the house. The house is the evidence. And you said, well, but why should I believe you? Why should I accept that you built the house? And I said, well, you should accept it, that it's true on my own authority. I told you that I built the house. The house is here, which proves that I built it, and I'm telling you that I built it. So you should accept it. You should just accept it. You should accept it on my own authority. Now, in such a scenario, what is more probable? Did I build the house, or did Acme Contractors build the house? Anyway, Van Til goes on and on and on about how presuppositional apologetics is the best thing ever, arguing with Buswell that his method of defending imaginary bullshit with no actual relevance to anything in reality is better than other methods of defending imaginary bullshit with no actual relevance to anything in reality for 11 more pages. Then we come to the next section of the chapter, which deals with Cecil de Boer's objection that Van Til doesn't do justice to secondary causes. De Boer objects that by diminishing secondary causes, Van Til is essentially equating all actions, including natural events and human actions, with God's action. De Boer agrees with Van Til that he needs God's grace in order to believe. Remember, these are theologians arguing with each other, but de Boer says that it is still he himself who does the believing, not God. And he says that under Van Til's system of thought, that distinction isn't really meaningful. If God is controlling everything, then what does it really mean if you believe or you don't believe, if you're just doing what God is making you do? Well, Van Til responds that he believes in secondary causes, but only those which are established by God. There could be no secondary causes without God as the ultimate cause behind them. Without God as the ultimate cause of everything, nothing would make sense and science wouldn't exist. But everything that happens according to God's plan and within God's control. So, are there secondary causes really? If God caused the secondary cause, and the result of the secondary cause was exactly what God always intended to happen, isn't the secondary cause a cause in name only? Isn't that kind of like saying that the cause of this domino falling was this domino falling? Which technically is true, but this domino wouldn't have fallen in the first place unless I pushed it. So really, this domino has no agency at all. It's just doing what the primary cause caused. It's not really a secondary cause in any meaningful way, because there was no chance that anything else was ever going to happen. God was making all of it happen in the only way that it ever could have happened, according to his plan and according to his omniscient knowledge of what was about to happen in the future. It's a secondary cause in name only. It's a cause in name only. God's the cause of everything in Van Til's system. In fact, according to Van Til, God must be the cause of everything, or else the universe would be chaos. So once again, it seems like a critic, Cecil de Boer in this case, is making a reasonable inference from something Van Til has written, and Van Til's rebuttal is basically to say, nope, that's not what I meant. And he doesn't explain how de Boer's inference is wrong, he just asserts that it is. He doesn't elucidate how in his system, where nothing happens without God intending it to happen or ultimately causing it to happen, and every event ever was planned out by God since forever, the concept of a secondary cause has any real meaning. He just asserts that it does. Next, Van Til responds to objections made by Jesse de Boer, the other de Boer, about his concept of contingency, which is a very closely related subject to the secondary cause matter. Van Til argues that his concept of contingency is what is taught in the Westminster Confession. In this sense, contingency refers to that which happens according to God's plan. It, like Van Til's notion of secondary cause, doesn't imply events happening outside of God's control. See, that is the whole crux of the disagreement. Van Til is insisting that everything always happens within God's control, and his critics in this case are saying, well, If everything always happens within God's control, then how can the concepts of contingency or secondary cause have any meaning whatsoever? Van Til says, quote, "On the other hand, all non-Christian thought thinks of the freedom of man, of secondary causes and contingency as quite independent of God's counsel, his creation, and his providence. This marks its ultimate indeterminism. One of the ingredients in a non-Christian philosophy of science is ultimate indeterminism." So all quantum determinists are Christians? They must be, if non-Christian philosophies of science are ultimately indeterministic. And who would know better about that than Van Til, right? You might remember from previous chapters that Van Til chafes at the suggestion that his Reformed theology is deterministic. And if that's the case, why is he taking the piss out of non-Christian science for supposedly being indeterministic? If determinism is bad, why is it bad for science to be indeterministic? Well, Van Til anticipates that question. He says that a Calvinist must be on guard to defend against both indeterminism and determinism. But see, divine determinism is okay. And Van Til doesn't use that term. He doesn't call what he is advocating divine determinism. But that's basically what he's advocating. That's what Calvinism is. It's not determinism based on natural factors. It's not determinism based on conditions naturally existing that could allow for no other events to take place. It's things happening according to God's will, according to God's plan. So everything is determined, but it's not determinism in the usual classical, philosophical, or scientific sense. It's divine determinism. It's God's determinism. And that's okay, even though Van Til doesn't ever describe it using the term determinism. But without it, Van Til says that there could be no such thing as facts, because facts are only facts because God says they are what they are. So in order for science to work, it must be, again, these are not Van Til's terms, but these are essentially what he is saying. Science must be divinely deterministic, not indeterminate. So that's why he says indeterminism in philosophies of science is a bad thing, or strongly implies that. At least I think that's what he means. If not, really, who gives a shit? I'm just kidding. If I've got it wrong, please comment and straighten me out. Just a little. Anyway, let's end my suffering, shall we? Well, not end it. I've got 4 episodes to go after this one. Let's suspend my suffering for another week, shall we? At the conclusion of chapter 10, Van Til says, quote, "Christianity is the sine qua non of the intelligibility of anything. Why am I so much interested in the foundations of science? It is A, because with Kuyper, I believe that God requires of us that we claim every realm of being for him, and B, because with Kuyper, I believe that unless we press the crown rights of our king in every realm, we shall not long retain them in any realm." Well, that sounds like a YP, Corny, not an MP. Sine qua non, by the way, means a necessary condition, if you're not cool like me and you know all the Latin phrases. Van Til is interested in the foundations of science not because he's fascinated by science itself, or because he wants to honestly explore the questions at the very bottom of the scientific enterprise, questions like what do we know, what can we know, how do we know what we think we know, how can we learn more. No, he's not actually interested in exploring those questions. He's not fascinated by science because of what we can learn through it, or because he attaches any value to it on its own. He's just interested in constructing a convoluted pseudo-philosophical argument that will enable him to co-opt science to serve his narrow, provincial, outrageously vain religion. And a thought that continually strikes me as I continue my way through this book comes to me again at this point. If God is all-powerful and self-sufficient, as Van Til claims, why does he need people like Cornelius Van Til to testify to his power and glory? Why does he need people like Cornelius Van Til to, as Van Til says in that quote, claim every realm of being for him? Seems like God will be able to take care of those sorts of things himself if everything Van Til writes about God turns out to be true. And in such a case, if the God of Cornelius Van Til does turn out to exist, it seems to me that the best that can be said about Cornelius Van Til is that he was a sucker, a mark who got conned, someone who God allowed to flatter himself with auspicious labels like theologian and apologist and minister of the gospel, when all he ever was actually was a monkey dancing to the sound of God's grinding organ. God's grinding organ, by the way, is the working title of my Bible/fic. That's the best case scenario for Van Til. If, as I strongly suspect, Van Til's God doesn't actually exist, then I'm afraid the inevitable conclusion is that Van Til spent his life thinking of reasons not to think, which is a dubious, paradoxical occupation made all the more pathetic by the fact that it was ultimately done in the service of nothing. Nothing, that is, other than Van Til's evidently considerable vanity. That's it for this chapter, for this episode. I will be back in the next video in this series to continue looking through this book, examining it from my atheist perspective. We'll be looking at chapter 11 of the Defense of the Faith, which is titled Christian Epistemology. So, there you go. If you thought that Christian metaphysics were fun, wait till we take a bite out of Christian epistemology, baby. I can't wait. I can actually. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, please leave a comment. Tell me what I got right. Tell me what I got wrong. Agree, disagree, do better than I did. I look forward to reading anything you have to say about this, be you atheist, Christian, Calvinist, Arminian, Romanist, whatever you happen to be. I welcome your insight on these issues. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.